Good morning, everyone. I want to say a huge thank you to Lab 2050 for having me here today. It is my first time in South Korea, and I have been overwhelmed by how welcoming the country has been, so thank you so much for having me. I am with the Economic Security Project. I'll give it a little bit of a background on who we are, but the place that I think is important to start is really what our goal is and how we think about our work. We believe that it is time to end poverty and rebuild the middle class in America, and we believe that a guaranteed basic income can be a part of the solution. So we start with a little bit of a different premise than some of the other folks who are experimenting with a basic income, in that we believe we have enough evidence around cash, and the real important questions are about how we do it. And so I'll share a little bit more about that. But I think the important place to start is, what do we know actually works? What do we owe each other within that? What is our obligation to our collective future? So often, particularly in the United States, when we talk about social policy and we talk about the ways that we're trying to build for the future, we don't actually think about what our goals are within that. Often politics gets in the way before we can have the big ideas conversation. And so for us, we wanted to stand out and start by defining, what do we know about the current world that we live in? What is the problem that we are trying to solve? The first, despite being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, more than half of Americans do not have enough savings on hand to cover a $400 emergency. So for example, your car breaks down and it's gonna be $3,000 to get it fixed. Where do you find that money? Your kid gets sick. Unlike other countries, including Finland and South Korea, our healthcare system is not as robust as it should be. What if your kid gets sick? What if they need medicine that's going to cost $500 and you don't have that because you're working a minimum wage job? We have a problem in the United States where Americans experience this emergency and find themselves entering a spiral into poverty. We also know that the social contract and the American dream that existed and defined a lot of people's economic lives in the United States for so long is increasingly not our reality. 94% of the jobs created since 2011 are part-time or contingent. Often, when people talk about what a good job looks like, they're talking about having a pension and earning enough money to support your family, having healthcare benefits. Those aren't the jobs that we're seeing anymore. Most often we think about the car sharing services, we think about, and I don't know if you guys have TaskRabbit here, a lot of people laud those programs because they provide flexibility, and that is important. That's an important part for a lot of people. But they also aren't paying enough, and they don't come with benefits. In a world where we have something called the working poor, where you can be poor and working 40 plus hours a week, we know the equation is not working. I think it's important to note that this also is something we're seeing have an outsized impact on the younger generation. As they enter the labor market, the jobs that they told they prepared their entire careers for aren't there. But we also know that Americans are starting to feel this. 72% of Americans believe that the government's policies since the recession have done little or nothing to help middle-class people. That's a real problem. When people are that level of frustrated and believe that their government's not doing enough to address the problem, it leads to discontent. And we have experienced that deeply in the United States for the past few years. And so I think the question that we all set out today is, what can we be doing? What are the big ideas that are out there? And I think we're in a unique moment in the United States where that question is being asked. So when we kind of take all of that and we try to package it up, we point to kind of three forces that we want to take into consideration as we think about the potential of a guaranteed income. The first is the concentration of economic and political power. The top 1% own more wealth than the bottom 40%. The fact that entrenched poverty has not budged in over 40 years. It's a different problem when we have this conversation than the rise of contingent work. There was a problem that existed before the current economic trends that we had not solved and had not dealt with. And we think it's important to call out the reinforcing trends among these two, but often very different core problems that are driving them. And then the third is the automation and fragmentation of particularly low-wage work. I can't think of a better example to point to than Google AI, which we already had a great example of today. But this is also taking shape in less sexy venues as well. It is the call centers. It is the workers who, in the United States, saw their jobs outsourced a generation ago, entered new jobs that are now being automated. And the experience of that is as important as the job going away. What does it mean to have to respond to an algorithm in the day-to-day? What kind of quality of life does that create? Those are questions we don't have the answer to yet, and we need to be thinking about and exploring as we think about what the future of our social contract and our economy looks like. So the Economic Security Project, after looking and thinking about these trends, came together under our three co-chairs. Natalie Foster, who is a future of work expert based out of Silicon Valley, Chris Hughes, who is one of the co-founders of Facebook, and Dorian Warren, who is a long-time anti-poverty activist who comes at this from a racial justice perspective in the United States. All of three of them were seeing and experiencing these changing economic trends through their work, and were attracted to the conversation around a basic and guaranteed income as a potential way forward to grapple with these shifts and these changes. So we organize our work in three ways. We think about what are the questions that we need to be asking. So we both fund and run initiatives on research. But we also believe that running experiments on the ground is extremely important, but is not sufficient as we try to explore this idea. So we also have already started to support political campaigns on the ground to actually implement versions of this idea. One example is in the Washington, D.C. area. They are running something called the Carbon Fee and Rebate campaign, where they're actually using carbon as a way to provide a dividend to individuals living in the District of Columbia. But we also know that there's a reason in the United States, at least, that our social contract is so frayed and for the past 40 years has been insufficient in solving poverty. We have deeply held cultural norms and expectations in the United States that keeps us from being as innovative and proactive around providing economic security as we could be. And if we were to just focus on the research and the hard questions, we would be ignoring some of the cultural realities that shape the kinds of ideas that individuals are open to. The guaranteed or basic income, as we all know, directly confronts a lot of those deeply held cultural norms. Can work be decoupled from income? What does it mean for everyone to be deserving? How do we understand what it means to give people money? Don't we think that we'll just spend it on alcohol and drugs is always the response that we get? And we have all the evidence in the world to demonstrate that low-income individuals do not, but that's not enough for people. We have to have a cultural and narrative conversation that highlights people's stories to overcome some of these biases and stigmas that keep people from being open to really big, bold ideas. So, what do we already know about basic income? What do we not know? And how do we change who's a part of the conversation? In the United States, we're very diverse, and one of the challenges is that the individuals making decisions often don't come from the communities that would have the most to gain or lose from policies and changes to policy. So we aim to make sure that the individuals, again, low-wage workers, individuals who are experiencing these technological shifts, are seeing it in their day-to-day jobs, are a part of the conversation.
People
so this is what we know.
around the world are turning to basic income as a way to ensure economic stability for everyone moving forward. But how do we know it will work? Over the last 50 years, there have been several experiments that provide clear evidence that unconditional cash works. One of the earliest experiments took place in the United States in the 70s and 80s, where we learned that people don't stop working when they receive cash assistance. The 70s also saw the Mincome experiment in Manitoba, Canada, where we saw hospitalization rates go down. Cash improves health. In 1997, the Eastern Band of Cherokees opened a casino and elected to distribute the revenues to tribe members as cash stipends. That money proved to have a positive effect on children's education. More recently, results from a program in Mexico found that cash transfers actually reduced smoking and alcohol consumption. And finally, in rural Kenya, one of the most robust experiments on unconditional cash found that people who received a basic income were less stressed and more satisfied with life. Still, other studies are just getting underway. In Finland, a nationwide experiment has just begun. In Ontario, researchers are looking at how cash will impact entire communities. In Oakland, researchers will be examining the health and well-being of individuals. And in Stockton, the mayor is launching a new demonstration project using cash to stabilize underserved communities and jumpstart economic mobility. With each experiment, we learn more about the positive effects of something as simple as cash. We have evidence pouring in from around the globe. The next question is, when will we be bold enough to enact a basic income?
So what the researchers will tell you in the room is all of those experiments are quite different. And so we learn something different from all of them. And I think we are in a unique moment where we can take that evidence and start to explore what it means for how we build social policy in all of these different and diverse contexts. But for us, what that video represents is that a conversation should not be about, does cash work? Will people stop working? Will they misspend it? Because we have that evidence. The question is, when we introduce cash transfers into our social safety net, how do we best design it to solve the problems that we face? And that's what directs then most of our research moving forward. So over the past year, we've invested in a range of think tanks, individuals who are asking some of the more difficult how do we do it questions, particularly in the United States. One example is that we funded the Roosevelt Institute, which is a think tank based in New York that works on a range of social and economic policy to model the macroeconomic effects of a universal basic income. In this particular one, they found a 12% growth to GDP. Again, the economists in the room will point out that it depends on how you assume how the economy works, which is always a fun conversation to have with economists. But we learned a lot around and really started to dispel some of the fears around the impact of a basic income. We also know that we have to ask hard questions of how do we pay for it. So we've started to model and look at how different pay-fors, whether taxation, a sovereign wealth fund that pulls on aggregate common resources, what the different implications for those pay-fors would be for our economy and on the individuals. For example, this is where we've learned from the value of not just working in the realm of research. The campaign in DC around the carbon fee and rebate or dividend there learned a tremendous amount by modeling this form of a guaranteed income in their community, and were able to then build the policy in a way that reinforced and stimulated the local economy, while actually making sure that a carbon fee, which normally is a regressive policy, was actually progressive in terms of its benefit and impact on low-income communities. We also invest in voices like Aisha.
I don't think we realize that our future is really determined by what we're exposed to and what we're allowed to dream about. I knew growing up exactly what I wanted to do when I became an adult. I knew I wanted to run a nonprofit. I knew I wanted to work in the community. That's because my grandmother was an activist. That's because my mother and all of my aunties are social workers. So that was my level of exposure. Living in poverty, if you do not have people feeding into you what your future can be, that's why we have these generations of poverty that exist.
I don't know what Aisha saw in me to even offer me the opportunity that she did, but I'm so thankful. Will you make it to the class today? We want you to get a certificate of completion. Don't make me have to come to the 16D, ma'am.
We talk about there being a lack of leadership in these communities. And I don't think it's a lack of leadership. I think people are exhausted, and I think their bandwidth is taxed. But if I have my bandwidth freed up and I actually have the ability to think and breathe and dream, I think some of the leadership that is just naturally in these communities will begin to manifest again.
Prior to my job, I really didn't think that far ahead. I just worried about what was right now. I'm going to school for social work. I know that's what my calling is now, and that's because of my job. I want to be able to do it on my own. My reality is I can't. I'm not ashamed to say that I need help. I am here to help other people, but I'ma still need help.
I think basic income could help in so many instances. Giving someone monthly cash would instill a sense of breathing room. I think it should be unconditional. I think we should trust people to know what it is that they need. And so I think having a basic income could really help transform communities across this country, because local leadership should begin to show back up and flourish.
If I can get one person to listen and to hear, I feel like I did something for that day. If I can get two, I'm overwhelmed. I'm kicking my heels up.
Folks with limited income are just like you and I. They have the same dreams that we have. They want their kids to go to college. They want their kids to have bright futures. They want grandbabies. They want the white picket fence. They want the opportunity to take vacations. They want the same thing that we want. We're not different. And that's the piece that I really think we have all got to get to. Their dreams that I have for my son are exactly the same dreams that they have for their families.
So we think stories like Aisha's and Valerie's are so important in the context of the research that we're all doing because of the antidote we have in the United States around the experiments in the 1970s. Back when there was a set of negative income tax, a version of basic income, experiments in the United States, they collected initial data out of places like Seattle and Detroit and other parts of the country. But with that initial collection of data, there was one of the reported out was a statistical error. It said that divorce rates increased, and then it said that labor participation dropped. While those numbers were important, there was two problems. The first was one, that the divorce rate was actually incorrect. But the second was with the labor force participation, is what researchers went back 2 decades later and actually asked people how they changed their time use. And what they found was that the reason the labor force participation dropped is because mostly high school age men stayed in school. They didn't drop out. And young mothers, didn't go back to work as fast and were able to spend critical months with their children. That's a story that if it had been told when the research first came out back in the 1970s, might have led to a different pathway. Instead, the Family Assistance Plan and the range of policies in the United States being considered at the time were scrapped because that data was not contextualized. That's why we think stories as a part of research, qualitative research, is so important. One of the other things I think is really valuable about Aisha and Valerie's story is that they're based in Mississippi. Out of curiosity, has anyone been to Mississippi in the United States? Most Americans have not been to Mississippi in the United States. It has one of the most regressive social safety nets. The state of Mississippi sends more money back to the federal government than it actually gives out in its community, despite having the highest poverty rate in the country, which shows you that while, again, we may have evidence around how providing social support for people makes a difference, makes a difference, it's not enough. We have to change our politics that we're operating in. We have to humanize people to be able to shift the conversation. Which is why we made our largest investment to date in something called the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. Mayor Michael Tubbs is a 27-year-old mayor in Stockton, California. He grew up in poverty, experienced, which is unfortunately too common in the United States, real violence with the death of a family member very young. he saw and experienced what it looked like for communities to be disinvested in. But he was an exception. He ended up going to Stanford University, getting a graduate degree, and then decided, after working for President Obama, to go back to Stockton and make a difference. After serving on the city council there, he then went on to be the mayor of Stockton, California. As he was thinking about the future of his city, Stockton, which is a great example of how automation has started to change the economic landscape. It's an hour from Silicon Valley, but could not be more different in terms of what the impact on technology is. While Silicon Valley is thriving, Stockton is struggling. He wanted to try big, bold ideas. And so that's when he came across the idea of a universal basic income. He approached our co-chairs. They came together and decided to do a very small-scale experiment focused on qualitative research, looking at the impact of a $500 a month stipend on 100 individuals. The project was launched in October of last year. It is in the design phase. We're asking the hard questions about how we want to think about this and how we want to structure the research to learn what we think is most important to learn. But it is the first municipal-led pilot. Unlike places like Finland and Ontario, Canada, where the government has been involved, this is the first government-engaged pilot in the United States. Which leads me, I think, where we think again it's important to have a conversation. Most of the world is talking about universal basic income as we understand it around the full version of it. Unconditional, no means tested, long-term, covers basic living expenses, distributed to everyone within a set region. But the conversation can and should be more nuanced than that. Different contexts require different realities. One thing Ollie really pointed out to us is that the social welfare state in Finland looks very different than the one in the United States. What is exciting about this moment is the opportunity to go a little bit deeper, to ask questions of how we design this. These are just some examples of the different versions that people are talking about in the United States. To think about the problems that we're trying to solve and how we then approach different solutions. That's why we believe that the way forward will require on-the-ground experiments, like the phenomenal pilots that are happening across the world, real moral imagination to ask ourselves, what is really happening in our economy? How is it impacting families? What should we be doing about it? What is our obligation? And also real political muscle. We have to start thinking about how we can change our systems. It is, while we all, I think, would love to design the perfect system and see it happen, that is so rarely how policy change actually happens. We need to start thinking about which communities and individuals are a part of the conversation and actually showing the way forward when it comes to our social policies and social systems. Thank you so much.